Emma Harper sat in the back seat of the yellow cab, her eyes fixed on the raindrops racing down the window. The soft hum of the engine and the faint patter of rain were the only sounds filling the small space between her and the driver. She shifted uncomfortably, crossing her legs and pulling her coat tighter around her body. The night had not gone as planned. Her husband, Mark, had cancelled their dinner reservation, again. Some late meeting, some unavoidable call. She'd stopped arguing about it months ago. Instead, she spent the evening alone at the rooftop bar of the hotel downtown, sipping wine and staring at the flickering city lights. "Where to?" the driver asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. His voice startled her. Emma met his eyes briefly before turning back to the window. He was younger than she expected. Maybe early 30s, with dark hair and sharp features. "Westbridge." "Cedar Lane," she replied softly. The driver nodded and pulled away from the curb. Emma didn't notice him looking at her again, just for a second longer than usual. Cedar Lane wasn't far, but the streets were flooded with traffic. Emma sat in silence, drumming her fingers on the edge of her purse. "You from around here?" the driver asked, breaking the quiet. Emma hesitated. She wasn't in the mood for small talk, but something in his tone was disarming. "Yeah," she said eventually. "Born and raised." "You?" The driver smiled faintly. "Moved here a few years ago." "Brooklyn originally." Emma nodded, leaning her head against the cold glass. She could feel his eyes flicker to the mirror, but he said nothing more. Another red light. Another pause in the ride that felt heavier than it should. "You look tired," he said after a moment. Emma stiffened. "Long day." "Rough night too, I bet." His words lingered longer than they should have. Emma turned to him sharply, but he wasn't looking at her. His eyes stayed on the road. "Something like that," she replied carefully. She watched the way his hands gripped the steering wheel, strong, steady. There was something about him, something different from the stale boardroom conversations she'd grown accustomed to with Mark. This man felt real, like he belonged to the world she'd almost forgotten existed. By the time they crossed into Westbridge, Emma found herself speaking more freely. She laughed at something he said about the city traffic, and for a fleeting moment, she forgot the weight pressing down on her chest. As the cab rolled to a stop outside her house, Emma hesitated. "Thanks for the ride," she said, handing him a crumpled bill. "No problem," he replied, fingers brushing hers briefly as he accepted the money. Their eyes met again, this time, neither looked away. Emma swallowed. She didn't know why, but she leaned just a little closer to the open window. "What's your name?" she asked quietly. "Daniel," he replied, his voice softer now. "Emma." A slight smirk tugged at his lips. "I know." She stepped back, biting the inside of her cheek. "I'll see you around, Daniel." "I'll be around," he said, pulling away slowly. Emma watched the cab disappear into the night. She stood in the driveway a little longer than necessary, unsure of what she was waiting for. The cab's engine hummed softly as the world outside faded into dusk. Emma sat still, her hand resting lightly on the door handle. A small voice in her head told her to leave, to step out and pretend none of this had happened. But she didn't. Daniel didn't rush her. His fingers tapped lazily against the steering wheel, his gaze flickering toward her now and then, waiting. Emma exhaled slowly. "I should go inside." "You could," he replied, his voice steady but inviting. "Or, we could keep driving." She hesitated. There was something about the ease in his words, the way he said it like it was the simplest choice in the world. No pressure. No expectation. But the weight of the moment sat heavily between them. Emma glanced toward the house. The lights were off. Mark wouldn't be home until late the next evening. "Where would we go?" she asked, her voice quieter than she expected. Daniel gave her a faint smile. Anywhere you want. That was the moment she crossed the first line. The city blurred past as they drove with no destination. Emma leaned back in her seat, the cool leather pressing against her shoulders as she watched the fading skyline through half-lidded eyes. I never really do this, she admitted, the confession slipping out before she could stop it. Daniel glanced at her. Do what? Stay in cabs longer than necessary. His smile widened. Maybe you needed a longer ride this time. Emma laughed softly under her breath. The simplicity of the statement felt oddly comforting. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about Mark or the unraveling threads of her marriage. She wasn't worried about unreturned texts or empty apologies. She was just there. With Daniel. They stopped near the waterfront. The city's lights reflected off the calm river, stretching like ribbons over the dark surface. Daniel pulled into an empty lot, killing the engine. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence, though present, wasn't uncomfortable. You don't have to stay, he said, his voice low. Emma looked at him, her hand sliding slowly off her lap. I know. She opened the door, stepping into the cool night air. The soft breeze brushed against her face as she walked toward the edge of the river, listening to the quiet lapping of the water against the rocks below. Daniel followed a few paces behind, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. I used to come here a lot, he said after a moment. Back when I first moved to the city. Emma glanced over her shoulder. Alone? Most of the time. She nodded. I can see why. The soft glow of street lamps traced the outline of his face as he looked out over the water. There was something steady about Daniel, something grounded. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to fill the air with unnecessary words. Emma found herself drawn to that. I don't know why I'm here, she admitted, almost more to herself than him. Daniel turned toward her, his expression unreadable. Maybe you just needed a break. Emma swallowed. Yeah. Maybe. Her eyes lingered on his face a little longer than they should have. By the time he dropped her off at home, it was well past midnight. Emma stepped out of the cab, gripping the edge of the door for just a second longer than necessary. Daniel's eyes met hers through the window. Good night, Emma. She offered a small, fleeting smile. Good night, Daniel. But as the cab pulled away, Emma knew this wasn't over. And she wasn't sure if she wanted it to be. The next day was ordinary, almost painstakingly so. Emma moved through her morning routine as if nothing had happened. Coffee. Emails. Half-hearted glances at her phone, hoping for messages from Mark that never came. But as the afternoon sun dipped lower, she found her thoughts drifting back to Daniel. It was ridiculous, she told herself. A fleeting moment. Nothing more. Yet, when she stepped outside to take a walk, Emma caught herself glancing toward the streets, half expecting to see the familiar yellow cab. And by some strange twist of fate, there he was. Parked on the corner across from the cafe, Daniel leaned casually against his cab, arms folded across his chest. As if he'd been waiting. Emma's heart skipped. She almost turned around, almost walked away. But she didn't. Instead, her feet carried her closer, pulled by something she couldn't quite name. You just happen to be here, she asked, tilting her head. Daniel smirked. Let's call it luck. Emma crossed her arms, but there was no real tension behind it. You stalk all your passengers like this? Only the interesting ones. She laughed softly, but the warmth in her chest caught her by surprise. Daniel gestured to the cab. Need a ride somewhere? Emma hesitated. She should have said no. She should have walked away. But instead, she nodded. Sure. Why not? The cab ride was longer this time, but neither of them minded. Daniel drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting casually by the window. Emma watched him out of the corner of her eye, noticing the small details she hadn't paid attention to before, how his jaw tensed slightly when he focused, the faint scar on his left knuckle, the way his gaze softened when he glanced her way. It felt dangerous. Not in the way she feared, but in the way she knew she'd want more. "Where to?" he asked. Emma thought for a moment. She could have given him her address. Or named some distant neighborhood. But instead, she said, "Surprise me." Daniel's lips curved into a slight smile. "All right," he replied. They drove for over an hour, winding through streets Emma didn't recognize. The cab eventually pulled to a stop outside a small diner on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering lazily in the evening light. Emma arched an eyebrow. "A diner?" Daniel shrugged. "You said to surprise you. Best pie in the city." She laughed but stepped out anyway, the cool air brushing against her skin. Inside, the diner was nearly empty. Faint music drifted from a jukebox in the corner, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the space. They slid into a booth by the window, the hum of the world outside growing distant. Over shared slices of pie, Emma found herself telling Daniel more than she expected. She spoke about her job, her love for painting, something she hadn't touched in years, and the strange loneliness that lingered, even in a house with someone else. Daniel listened quietly, his eyes never straying. And when it was his turn, he spoke about moving to the city alone, chasing something he still hadn't found. There was no rush. No pretense. Just two strangers sharing a quiet moment. But as the night stretched on, Emma realized something unsettling. She didn't feel like a stranger to him anymore. And maybe she didn't want to. The ride home was silent, but it wasn't uncomfortable. When Daniel pulled up outside her house, Emma lingered, her fingers curling around the strap of her purse. "I could get used to this," she admitted softly, not quite meeting his gaze. Daniel's hand brushed lightly against the back of his neck, his voice just as soft. "Me too." For a moment, neither of them moved. Emma felt the weight of his gaze on her, the soft hum of the cab filling the space between them. But she stepped out before anything more could happen. She wasn't ready yet. "Good night, Daniel," she whispered. Daniel's eyes followed her as she walked up the driveway. "Good night, Emma." But even as the cab drove away, Emma stood by the door, watching the spot where it had been. And deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. The days blurred together, but Emma found herself anticipating the sound of tires against her driveway far more than she should have. Mark had returned from his trip without fanfare, tired, distracted, offering only a half-hearted kiss on the cheek before retreating into his home office. Conversations between them felt more like obligations, mechanical and brief. Emma told herself it wasn't fair to blame him entirely. They had both drifted, years of comfort turning into quiet distance. But that didn't stop her from noticing the ache in her chest every time he passed by without really looking at her. And it didn't stop her from stepping outside when she saw the yellow cab parked on the corner one evening. Daniel leaned against the car, arms folded as if he belonged there. Emma hesitated at the end of the driveway. She could feel the weight of the house behind her, the soft glow of light spilling from the windows. Mark was inside, still at his desk, unaware of the pull that had led her out into the cool night air. "Late shift?" she asked, her voice quieter than intended. Daniel smirked, the corners of his mouth lifting. "Something like that." Emma stepped closer, her fingers grazing the edge of the passenger door. She didn't have to explain why she was there. Daniel opened the door for her without a word. They drove in silence for a while, the soft hum of the engine settling around them. Emma traced patterns on the fogged window, her thoughts heavier than she liked to admit. Finally, she broke the silence. "Does this feel wrong to you?" Daniel glanced at her, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't quite place. "Should it?" he asked. Emma exhaled slowly. "I don't know." The truth was, she'd stopped trying to define what this was. Whatever existed between them lived in the spaces they didn't dare name. I think, Daniel said carefully, that people find each other for a reason. Emma swallowed. And what reason is this? His grip on the wheel tightened slightly. Maybe you just needed someone to remind you that you're still here. The simplicity of the statement hit harder than she expected. Emma turned to him, searching his face for something, anything, that might explain why she kept coming back to him. But Daniel didn't press for answers. Instead, he pulled the cab into an empty lot by the waterfront, the same spot where they had stood just days before. This time, Emma didn't stay by the river's edge. She lingered by the car, leaning against the cool metal as Daniel joined her. Their shoulders brushed faintly, and Emma didn't pull away. "You're easy to talk to," she admitted softly. Daniel chuckled. "I drive people around for a living. Comes with the job." "Maybe," Emma replied, turning toward him. "But I doubt they all come back for more." Daniel's eyes met hers, something unspoken lingering in the space between them. "No," he said quietly. "Not all of them." Emma's breath caught, but she didn't look away. There was no pretense in his gaze, no carefully chosen words. And she found herself leaning closer. The kiss wasn't planned. It was soft at first, cautious. But when Emma didn't pull away, Daniel's hand found the small of her back, drawing her in just enough to close the distance entirely. Her heart pounded louder than it should have, her fingers curling into his jacket as the world around them faded into quiet nothingness. When they finally parted, Emma's lips lingered near his, her breath unsteady. "I should go," she whispered, though the words lacked conviction. Daniel's thumb brushed lightly against her wrist. "Do you want to?" Emma hesitated. The answer should have been yes. But she didn't say it. Instead, she rested her forehead against his, closing her eyes for just a moment longer than she should have. When she finally stepped back, her heart felt heavier than before. "I'll call you," Daniel said softly as she climbed back into the cab. Emma didn't respond. But deep down, she knew she would. Emma barely remembered the drive home. Her thoughts drifted in and out, tangled between the lingering feel of Daniel's kiss and the unsettling weight of what it meant. By the time the cab rolled to a stop outside her house, she hesitated, her hand gripping the door handle. The lights were still on inside. Mark was home. Emma exhaled, smoothing the creases in her coat before stepping out. Daniel's voice stopped her just as she reached the front steps. "Emma." She turned, catching his gaze through the open window. His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes softened. "Good night," he said simply. Emma forced a small smile. "Good night, Daniel." But the moment she stepped inside, the warmth faded, replaced by the cool hush of reality. Mark's voice called from the kitchen. "That you?" "Yeah," Emma replied, slipping off her shoes. "Went for a walk." Mark emerged, leaning against the doorframe with a glass of scotch in hand. His tie was loosened, sleeves rolled up. He looked exhausted. "You should have told me. I would have gone with you." Emma's stomach twisted. It wasn't entirely true. She'd asked him to take a walk with her earlier, but he'd brushed it off, too buried in his work. "It's fine," she said quietly, brushing past him. Mark didn't push. He returned to his office, leaving Emma alone in the dimly lit living room. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She already knew who it was. The messages were simple. "Daniel, I meant what I said earlier." "Emma, I know." "Daniel, I'll be around if you need another ride." Emma's fingers hovered over the screen. A part of her wanted to delete the conversation, bury it before it unraveled further. But she didn't. Instead, she slipped the phone onto the table and sat by the window, staring out at the empty street below. She told herself it had only been a kiss. But even she knew it was more than that. The next morning, Mark left early. A weekend conference in Chicago, another excuse for distance that Emma didn't argue against. By noon, the house felt suffocating. Emma paced the living room, standing by the window as if she expected to see Daniel's cab pass by. She almost called him. Almost. But before she could convince herself to press the button, her phone buzzed again. "Daniel, if you're free, I could use some company." "No pressure." Emma's heart skipped. She stared at the message longer than she should have, her thumb hovering over the reply. Then she typed two simple words. "On my way." The diner felt smaller in the daylight. Daniel was already there, leaning in a booth near the window. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. Emma slid into the seat across from him, tucking her hair behind her ear as if to compose herself. "I didn't think you'd actually show up," Daniel admitted with a faint smirk. Emma arched a brow. "You texted me first." He chuckled. "Fair point." The conversation felt easier than it should have. There were no awkward pauses, no questions about why they were really there. But beneath the surface, Emma felt the weight of it. "You never told me why you started driving cabs," she said after a moment. Daniel leaned back, his arm draped lazily over the seat. "I needed the money. Left a corporate job a while back. Turns out I hated sitting in an office all day." Emma smiled faintly. "I get that. And you? Why do you paint?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't," she admitted softly. "Not anymore." Daniel's gaze lingered on her, thoughtful and quiet. "You should," he said. "You talk about it like you miss it." Emma felt her pulse quicken, her fingers curling against the edge of the table. "It's complicated." Daniel didn't push. But his eyes told her he understood. By the time they left the diner, the sun had dipped behind the clouds, casting long shadows over the street. Daniel walked her to the cab, his hand brushing against hers briefly as he opened the door. Emma hesitated. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked quietly. Daniel's eyes met hers, the faint flicker of something unreadable behind them. "Sometimes." The space between them felt thin, fragile. Emma swallowed the lump in her throat, her gaze flickering to his lips for just a second too long. And just like that, the line blurred again. The kiss was softer this time, slower, as if they were both testing how far they were willing to go. When they finally pulled away, Emma lingered, her forehead resting against his. "I should go," she whispered, though neither of them moved. Daniel's thumb traced gentle circles against the back of her hand. "I know." But Emma didn't leave right away. Because, for the first time in a long time, she didn't want to. Emma hadn't planned to stay long. But as the rain started to fall softly against the cab's windshield, she found herself hesitating, her hand resting loosely on the door handle. The air between her and Daniel felt heavier than before, charged with something neither of them had the courage to name. "I should head back," she said softly, but the words felt like a half-hearted attempt to convince herself. Daniel's gaze drifted toward her, his hand still resting on the steering wheel. His eyes weren't questioning. They were patient, waiting for her to decide. "I can take you," he offered, but there was something in his tone that hinted he wasn't eager to drive her home just yet. Emma hesitated for a moment longer. Her house was only 10 minutes away, but the thought of stepping back into that cold, empty space made her chest tighten. "Or," Daniel added, watching her carefully, "you could stay. Just for a little while." Emma met his eyes, her pulse quickening. It was dangerous, this moment. But she didn't say no. They sat in the cab for a while, parked beneath the flickering street lamp outside Daniel's apartment building. Neither of them moved to get out, as if acknowledging the next step would make it harder to return to their separate lives. Emma traced circles on her palm with her thumb, her breathing shallow. "This is insane," she said with a soft, breathy laugh. Daniel leaned back in his seat, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. A little. The cab's interior felt too small, like the space between them wasn't enough to keep things from unraveling. "Tell me to leave," Emma whispered, though even she wasn't sure she meant it. Daniel's eyes softened as he reached over, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. His touch lingered for just a second longer than necessary. "I don't want to," he replied. And neither did she. The apartment was simple, modest furniture, warm tones, and large windows that overlooked the city. Emma stood just inside the doorway, her hands nervously clutching the strap of her purse. It felt like crossing some invisible threshold, and yet she didn't turn back. Daniel hung his jacket on the hook by the door and gestured to the small kitchen. "Drink?" Emma nodded. "Sure. Whatever you have." He poured 2 glasses of wine, setting one in front of her as she settled onto the couch. The cushions sank slightly beneath her, and she found herself exhaling for the first time in what felt like hours. Daniel sat beside her, closer than he needed to be but not close enough to make her uncomfortable. "I don't usually do this," Emma admitted, swirling the wine in her glass. Daniel smiled faintly. "I know." There was no judgment in his voice. No expectation. Emma felt her defenses slip, just a little. "I don't know why I keep coming back," she confessed softly. Daniel leaned in slightly, his elbow resting on the back of the couch. "Maybe you don't want to feel alone." Emma's heart twisted at his words. Because he wasn't wrong. And as his hand brushed lightly against hers, Emma knew she had crossed the point of no return. The next morning, Emma woke to soft light filtering through the apartment's sheer curtains. Daniel's side of the bed was empty, but the faint sound of water running in the shower told her he hadn't gone far. For a brief, fleeting moment, everything felt normal. But as she sat up, reality crept back in. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Mark. Emma stared at the screen, her heart sinking as guilt settled in her chest like a weight she couldn't ignore. She let the call go to voicemail. When Daniel emerged from the bathroom, towel wrapped around his waist and hair damp, Emma forced a smile she didn't quite feel. "I should head back," she said quietly, slipping out of bed. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, watching her with a calm expression. "You sure?" Emma hesitated. "Yeah." But as she gathered her things, she knew this wouldn't be the last time. And that terrified her more than anything else. The house was quiet when Emma returned. Mark's car was in the driveway, but the lights in his office were dimmed. She slipped inside quietly, toes pressing against the cool wooden floor as she set her purse down by the door. Her reflection caught her in the hallway mirror, hair tousled, collar slightly wrinkled. She smoothed her blouse with trembling fingers, but no amount of effort erased the weight behind her eyes. The guilt had followed her home. Emma didn't need to look upstairs to know Mark was still asleep. His absence from the living room told her everything she needed to know. He hadn't waited up. She paused in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water she didn't really need. The weight of Daniel's touch still lingered faintly on her skin, ghost-like and impossible to shake. For a moment, she stood there, caught between 2 lives she couldn't reconcile. Mark and Daniel. Her husband and the man who wasn't supposed to mean anything. But he did. And that scared her more than the affair itself. Mark emerged an hour later, still in his robe, hair slightly tousled from sleep. Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, pretending to read a book she wasn't following. "Morning," he greeted, voice rough with sleep. He leaned against the counter, pouring coffee without looking at her. "Morning," Emma replied softly, folding the corner of the page even though she hadn't finished the chapter. Mark glanced at her briefly, his eyes lingering just long enough to register something he didn't say out loud. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked. Emma hesitated. "Yeah. I was out for a while." It wasn't a lie, not entirely. She had slept. Just not here. Mark nodded absently, already scrolling through emails on his phone. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma spent the afternoon painting. The canvas stretched before her, stark and white, waiting for color to fill the emptiness. It had been months since she picked up a brush, but something inside her needed an outlet, somewhere to place the tangled mess of emotions she couldn't shake. Her strokes were hesitant at first, soft swirls of blue and gray bleeding across the canvas. But as the hours passed, the shapes began to take form, waves crashing along a distant shore, dark clouds curling at the horizon. It felt too familiar. Daniel's face flickered in her thoughts as the brush dragged across the canvas. Emma wiped her hands on her apron, stepping back to examine her work. She didn't know what she expected to find, but the image staring back at her felt more revealing than she intended. Loneliness. It had seeped into the painting, just as it had crept into her life. That evening, Mark left for another late meeting. Emma didn't ask for details. She watched from the window as his car disappeared down the street, headlights flickering against the fading light. Her phone buzzed in the silence that followed. Daniel, still awake? Emma hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keys. She could ignore it. Pretend she hadn't seen it and bury herself in the comfort of familiarity. But she didn't. Emma, yeah. Can't sleep. Daniel, want company? Her heart pounded, torn between reason and impulse. But the ache in her chest was stronger than her guilt. Emma, come by. 20 minutes later, Daniel's cab pulled up outside. Emma met him at the door, not caring that she was still in sweats and an oversized sweater. Daniel's eyes softened as he stepped inside, brushing rain from his jacket. You sure about this? He asked quietly, his gaze searching hers. Emma swallowed hard. I don't know. Daniel's hand brushed lightly against her arm, the warmth of his touch grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. But she didn't stop him. And as his lips met hers, Emma realized she had no intention of letting him go. The rain tapped softly against the windowpane, filling the quiet space between them. Emma lay curled against Daniel's side, her head resting lightly on his chest. His arm draped over her back, his fingers tracing soft circles along her shoulder blade. Neither of them spoke. For the first time in weeks, Emma felt calm. The weight of her thoughts, the ache in her chest, they all seemed distant, softened by the warmth of Daniel's presence beside her. But reality crept in slowly, like a cold draft slipping beneath the door. Emma's eyes lingered on the clock above the fireplace. It was nearly midnight. Mark's meeting would be wrapping up soon. She should have asked Daniel to leave. But she didn't. Instead, she stayed still, allowing the illusion to linger a little longer. You're quiet tonight, Daniel said softly, his voice rumbling beneath her ear. Emma hesitated, fingers tracing the faint lines of his collarbone. I'm just thinking. Daniel shifted slightly, tilting his head to meet her gaze. About him? She didn't answer right away. I guess, she admitted. But not in the way you think. Daniel's hand brushed against her cheek, his touch lingering longer than necessary. You don't have to explain it to me. Emma's chest tightened. That was the thing about Daniel, he never pressed for answers. He let the silence speak for itself, filling the spaces Mark had left untouched. And that made it harder to walk away. An hour later, Daniel slipped out the back door. Emma watched him disappear into the night, his cab pulling away slowly down the empty street. The faint glow of his taillights flickered against the wet pavement, fading into the distance. She stood there long after he was gone, arms crossed against the chill creeping in through the open doorway. By the time Mark returned, Emma was sitting by the fireplace, a half-finished glass of wine resting on the table beside her. Hey, Mark greeted, loosening his tie as he stepped inside. You're still up? Emma glanced at him, offering a faint smile she didn't quite feel. Couldn't sleep. Mark kissed the top of her head absent-mindedly, already scrolling through his phone as he sank into the chair across from her. "I know the feeling," he muttered. The conversation ended there, like so many before it. Emma watched him from across the room, searching for something in his face that might tether her back to him. But all she saw was a man who had grown comfortable in her absence. And she wasn't sure who to blame for that. The next morning, Emma found herself painting again. The canvas stretched before her, the same dark blues and grays curling along the edges like storm clouds. She worked in silence, the brush moving almost instinctively across the surface. But as she stepped back, Emma realized the image staring back at her wasn't of distant waves or far-off skies. It was Daniel. The lines were abstract, the details blurred. But the shape of him, the slope of his shoulders, the faint tilt of his head, was unmistakable. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She set the brush down carefully, staring at the painting as if it might unravel the tangle of emotions she'd been avoiding. But the truth was already there, etched into every stroke. Daniel had become more than a distraction. And that terrified her. Later that afternoon, Emma met Daniel for coffee downtown. It wasn't planned. She had told herself she wouldn't call him, that she needed time to sort through the unraveling mess she was creating. But when he texted, she answered without hesitation. They sat by the window, watching the rain drizzle against the glass. Daniel's hand brushed lightly against hers beneath the table, his fingers curling around hers as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Emma glanced down at their intertwined hands, her heart pounding louder than it should have. "This is getting dangerous," she murmured. Daniel smiled faintly, his thumb tracing slow circles against her skin. "Maybe. But I think we passed that point a while ago." Emma's lips tugged into a small, reluctant smile. She hated how right he was. When she returned home that evening, Mark was waiting for her in the kitchen. His eyes flickered to the clock, then back to her. "You were out late," he noted casually, though something in his tone felt heavier than usual. Emma set her keys down carefully on the counter. "I grabbed coffee downtown. Needed to clear my head." Mark studied her for a moment longer, but he didn't press further. Instead, he nodded, returning his attention to his laptop. The distance between them had grown so wide, Emma wondered if he even noticed she was slipping away. Or worse, if he did notice and didn't care. The days that followed felt like stolen moments, brief pockets of time Emma carved out in between the life she was supposed to live and the one she found herself running toward. Mark left early most mornings, his schedule packed with meetings Emma didn't bother asking about anymore. She filled the space he left behind with painting, long walks, and Daniel. Always Daniel. It wasn't supposed to escalate this far. But here she was, sitting in the passenger seat of his cab as they drove aimlessly through the city on a Thursday afternoon. "You sure you don't need to pick up fares?" Emma asked, glancing at him with a teasing smirk. Daniel chuckled softly. "I think I'll survive." She watched him drive, his focus on the road but his hand resting comfortably on the center console between them. Emma's fingers drifted closer, brushing against his hand without thinking. Daniel responded instantly, curling his fingers around hers in a way that felt too natural. They stopped at a red light and Daniel's eyes shifted toward her, lingering in that quiet, knowing way she had grown used to. Emma's heart thudded louder than it should have. "You could let me out here," she suggested lightly. "I'll walk the rest of the way home." Daniel arched a brow. "And let you get soaked." Emma glanced at the drizzling rain outside, smiling faintly. "It's just a little rain." "I don't mind the drive," Daniel replied, his grip on her hand tightening slightly as if he knew she didn't really want to leave. And he was right. Emma stayed. By the time they pulled up outside her house, the rain had stopped, leaving a faint mist hanging in the air. The cab idled quietly in the driveway, but neither of them moved to end the moment. Daniel turned toward her, his gaze tracing the delicate slope of her jaw, the way her eyes softened when she wasn't guarding herself. Emma felt the weight of his stare, but she didn't look away. "You ever think about what happens next?" Daniel asked softly. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had asked herself that same question more times than she cared to admit. But no matter how many scenarios she played out in her mind, none of them ended cleanly. I try not to, she admitted. Daniel studied her carefully, his expression unreadable. I don't want to be the reason something breaks, he said, his thumb tracing soft circles against her palm. Emma swallowed hard. It was already broken, she whispered. The words hung between them, fragile and dangerous. But Daniel didn't let go of her hand. And Emma didn't ask him to. That evening, Mark came home earlier than expected. Emma was folding laundry in the living room when he walked in, loosening his tie and running a hand through his hair. You're home early, Emma noted, keeping her voice casual. Mark set his briefcase down by the door, offering a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Meeting got cancelled. Thought I'd catch up on some things here. Emma nodded, carefully folding one of Mark's dress shirts. He crossed the room, pressing a soft kiss to the top of her head as he passed. It felt automatic, like muscle memory rather than affection. But as Mark lingered near the doorway, his gaze drifted toward the window. You've been out a lot lately, he said, his tone light but probing. Taking more walks than usual. Emma's hands stilled briefly on the fabric. I guess I just needed the air, she replied carefully. Mark nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on her for a moment too long. But he didn't say anything more. Instead, he disappeared into his office, the door closing softly behind him. Emma released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. And for the first time, she wondered if Mark had started asking himself the same unspoken questions she had been avoiding. Emma sat at the kitchen table long after Mark disappeared into his office. The low hum of his phone calls drifted faintly through the closed door, muffled but persistent. She stared at the untouched cup of tea in front of her, the steam curling lazily into the air. For the first time in weeks, Emma felt uneasy. Mark's comment lingered in her mind, circling like a vulture over something fragile and exposed. He had noticed. Maybe he didn't know what he was seeing yet, but the cracks were showing. Emma's phone vibrated softly on the table. Daniel, you okay? Her thumb hovered over the screen, but she hesitated before typing back. Emma, I'm fine. It wasn't a lie. Not really. But it wasn't the truth either. Later that night, Mark joined her in the living room. He settled onto the couch beside her, his arm draping over the back casually, like it had so many times before. Emma glanced sideways at him, her book resting in her lap. Mark's eyes weren't on her. They were fixed on the television, a news anchor droning on about market trends and international affairs. Still, his presence was heavier than usual. Emma turned a page she hadn't read. I was thinking, Mark said suddenly, breaking the quiet. We should take a trip. Just the two of us. Emma's fingers tensed around the book cover. A trip, she repeated, careful not to let her voice betray her. Mark nodded, finally glancing her way. Yeah. It's been a while since we had time, just us. Maybe it'll help. His words were careful, but Emma heard what he wasn't saying. Help. Help what? Emma swallowed. Where would we go? I don't know. Maybe the coast. You always liked it there. Emma forced a small smile. She had liked the coast, years ago. But that version of herself felt distant now, like a painting hung in someone else's home. Yeah. Maybe. Mark studied her carefully, as if weighing her reaction. But Emma kept her expression soft, her hands steady. She had spent years perfecting this quiet performance. And tonight was no different. When Mark fell asleep, Emma stood by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, tired, distant, but still her own. Her phone buzzed again. Daniel, I'm parked around the corner. Can't sleep. Emma's heart skipped. She pressed her forehead lightly against the cool glass, eyes drifting toward the dark street below. Her pulse thrummed louder than it should have. "Emma, I can't tonight." The reply came almost instantly. Daniel understood. Simple. Direct. But the ache it left behind was anything but. The next morning, Mark left for work without mentioning the trip again. Emma stood in the doorway, watching his car disappear down the street. The house felt hollow after he left, filled only by the soft ticking of the kitchen clock and the distant hum of traffic outside. Emma sat at the table, turning Daniel's message over in her mind. He had given her an out. And she had taken it. So why did it feel like a mistake? By noon, Emma found herself walking along the riverside, hands buried deep in the pockets of her coat. The clouds hung low, the wind carrying the faint smell of rain. She didn't know where she was going. But when she spotted Daniel's cab parked by the water, she knew she had already made the decision. Daniel leaned against the hood, arms crossed, his eyes softening as he saw her approach. "Didn't think you'd come," he said quietly, tucking his hands into his jacket. Emma stopped a few steps away, the wind tugging gently at her hair. "I wasn't going to," she admitted. Daniel held her gaze for a long moment. "But you did." Emma nodded. And that was enough. The wind rippled softly across the water, carrying the silence between Emma and Daniel. They stood there for a long time, neither rushing to fill the quiet. Emma's heart was pounding, not from excitement, but from the gnawing realization that she was standing at the edge of something she couldn't undo. Daniel shifted slightly, his hands buried deep in his pockets. "You keep showing up," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "But I feel like you're halfway out the door every time." Emma's eyes dropped to the ground. "I know," she whispered. Daniel stepped closer, his warmth brushing against her skin. "Emma, I'm not asking for promises. I need to know what this is." Emma's chest tightened. What was this? A distraction? An escape from the quiet distance she had grown so used to with Mark? Or was it more, a dangerous pull she hadn't been strong enough to resist? "I don't know," she admitted, forcing herself to meet Daniel's gaze. "I didn't plan for any of this." Daniel's hand brushed lightly against hers, but he didn't hold it. "You're not happy with him," Daniel said carefully, searching her eyes. "But are you ready to leave him?" The question hit harder than she expected. Emma's lips parted, but no answer came. Because the truth was, she didn't know if she was ready. Daniel's eyes softened as if he already understood. He let out a quiet breath and stepped back. "You should figure that out," he said gently. "I'll be here when you do." Emma's heart ached at the finality in his voice. But she knew he was right. That night, Emma sat alone in the living room, staring at the flickering glow of the fireplace. Mark was still at the office, his absence stretching long into the evening. She thought about calling Daniel. But she didn't. Instead, she sat in silence, letting the weight of everything settle over her. It was time to stop running from the inevitable. When Mark returned home, Emma was waiting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea resting between her palms. Mark paused in the doorway, setting his briefcase down carefully by the counter. "You're still up?" Emma nodded, her gaze fixed on him. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. Mark's brow furrowed, but he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "What's on your mind?" Emma's fingers tightened around the mug, the warmth grounding her. She took a breath. "I feel like we've been drifting for a while," she began carefully, her voice steady but soft. "I've tried to ignore it, but I can't anymore." Mark's eyes darkened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "I'm not sure how we got here," Emma continued, her heart thudding painfully against her ribs. "But I think we both know something's missing." Mark leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Are you saying you want to leave?" he asked, his voice surprisingly calm. Emma hesitated. I don't know, she admitted. But I know we can't keep pretending everything's fine. Mark studied her for a long time, his gaze flickering with something she hadn't seen in months, maybe longer. Is there someone else? He asked bluntly. Emma's breath hitched, her grip tightening on the mug. For a fleeting moment, she considered lying. But the weight of dishonesty felt heavier than the truth. There is, she said softly. But it's not why I feel this way. I think I was already gone before he came along. Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. The silence that followed was suffocating. Emma braced herself for anger, for accusations or denial. But instead, Mark's shoulders slumped, the exhaustion seeping into his features. I guess I should have seen it coming, he murmured. Emma's heart ached, guilt creeping in like an unwelcome guest. I'm sorry, she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for, the affair or the slow unraveling of their marriage. Mark exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the table. I think I knew, he admitted quietly. But I didn't want to face it. The weight of his words hung heavily between them. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Eventually, Mark stood, running a hand through his hair. I need some air. Emma nodded, watching as he grabbed his coat and stepped out onto the porch. She remained at the table, staring into the remnants of her tea, knowing that no matter what happened next, things would never return to the way they were. The house was quiet in Mark's absence. The faint creak of the porch door closing echoed softly through the hallway, leaving Emma alone with the heavy stillness that followed. She stared down at her hands, her fingers tracing the rim of the empty tea mug. A part of her wanted to run, to leave before the weight of the conversation sank any deeper. But she stayed, allowing herself to sit in the discomfort. Because this time, there was no escaping it. When Mark finally returned, his footsteps were slower, more deliberate. He stopped in the doorway, his coat still damp from the cold night air. Emma met his gaze carefully, her heart beating louder than she cared to admit. He set his coat down without a word and returned to the chair across from her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table as he intertwined his fingers. His eyes, tired but calm, held hers with quiet resolve. I don't want to fight, he said softly. Emma's chest tightened. I don't either, she whispered. Mark exhaled, leaning back slightly. His gaze drifted to the window, where faint raindrops clung to the glass. I thought if we just kept going, things would fix themselves, he admitted. I guess I didn't want to believe we were losing this. Emma swallowed hard, guilt rising like a tide she couldn't hold back. I don't think it's just one thing, she said gently. Maybe it's been happening for a while. Mark nodded, his expression unreadable. And him? Emma's heart ached at the softness in his voice, not accusatory, but curious. He wasn't the reason, she said carefully. But he made me realize how far apart we've grown. Mark's eyes flickered to hers, and for a fleeting moment, Emma saw the hurt lingering just beneath the surface. But there was no anger, no bitterness. Only quiet acceptance. What now? He asked, his voice low but steady. Emma hesitated. I think we need space, she replied honestly. For both of us. Mark leaned back, considering her words. I don't want to lose you, he admitted after a long pause. But I also don't want to hold on if you've already let go. Emma's breath caught in her throat. I haven't let go completely, she whispered. But I think we need to figure out if we can find each other again. Mark nodded slowly, his gaze softening. I guess that's fair. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It felt like the calm after a storm, fragile but necessary. The next morning, Emma packed a small overnight bag. She wasn't leaving for good, just enough time to step away, to breathe. Mark kissed her lightly on the forehead as she stood by the door. Take whatever time you need, he said softly. Emma searched his face, feeling the weight of everything unspoken between them. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Mark offered a small, tired smile. "Me too." As Emma stepped outside, the cool air wrapped around her, sharp but refreshing. Daniel's cab was waiting at the corner, just as it had been so many nights before. But this time, Emma didn't climb inside. She met Daniel's gaze through the window, offering him a small, grateful nod. And then she turned, walking down the street with no clear destination, only the quiet certainty that for the first time in a long while, she wasn't running away. She was moving forward.